Hey there, welcome back to Whispers of RPG. Ever wondered about the hidden stories lurking behind your favorite games? Tonight, we're diving into the mysterious world of Elden Ring to unravel the heartbreaking tales of its legendary demigods. Let's uncover their secrets together. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the sorrowful destinies of Queen Ma's children. From the Golden Prince, who became death itself, to the Imperial twins, cursed from birth. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin this melancholic adventure together. In the shadow of the great Erd tree, where golden light once promised eternal order, stands a family broken by curses, ambition, and the weight of divine blood. These are the demigods, children and descendants of Queen Ma the Eternal, each bearing within them both the blessing and burden of their godly heritage. Their stories are not tales of triumph, but chronicles of suffering, sacrifice, and the inexorable march toward doom that seems to follow all who dare reach for divinity. To understand the tragedy of the demigods, we must first comprehend what it means to be born of divine blood in the lands between. These beings, blessed with power beyond mortal ken, were also cursed with fates that no amount of strength could alter. From the moment of their births, they were pawns in cosmic games played by forces far greater than themselves, destined to either ascend to godhood or fall as sacrifices upon the altar of ambition. The demigods exist in three primary lineages, each marked by its own particular brand of sorrow. First, the golden lineage, born of Queen Ma and her first consort, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. These children bore the pure gold of the Erd tree in their veins. Yet, even this blessing became a curse when the golden order they represented began to crumble. Second, the Carrion bloodline born of the union between Rathagen and Renala, queen of the full moon. These children straddled two worlds caught between the cosmic order of the stars and the earthly dominion of gold. And finally, the twin prodigies born of Ma and Rathagen's union, who despite their incredible potential, or perhaps because of it suffered the most terrible curses of all. Each lineage tells a different story of how divine blood can become both gift and poison. How the very qualities that make one special can also ensure their destruction. The golden lineage would know the pain of being cast aside when their purpose was fulfilled. The Carrion children would face the agony of divided loyalties and the corruption of their noble ideals, and the twins would bear curses so profound that they would spend their entire existence fighting against their own nature. The tragedy begins with understanding that these demigods, despite their power, were never truly free. From birth, they were bound by the expectations of their divine mother, by the emanations of outer gods, and by the inexorable weight of destiny itself. Queen Ma's own words echo through eternity like a death sentence. Hear me, demigods, my children, beloved. Make Make of thyself that which ye desire, be it a lord, be it a god. But should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken. This maternal decree was not encouragement, but ultimatum. It set her children upon a path where only perfection would suffice, where any failure to achieve the impossible would result in abandonment and destruction. It was a command that would drive some to madness, others to desperate measures, and all of them toward the very fates they sought to avoid. The golden lineage stands as perhaps the most tragic of all the demigod bloodlines, for they began with such promise only to meet the most catastrophic ends. At the head of this lineage stands Godwyn the Golden, the firstborn son of Queen Ma and Godfrey. Godwyn was everything a divine prince should be. Noble, brave, beloved by his subjects, and possessed of a power that could bend even the mightiest dragons to his will. He was the golden child in every sense, unmarked by curse or corruption, a being of such purity that even his enemies respected him. Godwyn's early life reads like a heroic legend. When the ancient dragons led by the mighty Grand Saxes assaulted the capital of Lindell and breached its supposedly impregnable walls, it was Godwyn who led the defense. The young prince faced Down Forsax, one of the most powerful ancient dragons in single combat. But rather than simply defeating his foe, Godwyn did something remarkable. He befriended the great dragon. This act of compassion and strength not only ended the dragon war, but established the ancient dragon cult within Lendil, allowing knights to learn the power of lightning itself. This friendship between prince and dragon would prove prophetic, for it demonstrated Godwyn's greatest strength, his ability to transform enemies into allies, to find peace where others saw only conflict. He was beloved not just by his human subjects, but by creatures that had been mortal enemies of his kind. In him, the Golden Order found its perfect representative, a being who could embody the best aspects of divine rule without falling into the typical traps of pride and tyranny. Yet it was precisely this perfection that made Godwyn's fate so devastating. On a night of wintry fog, when shadows moved with purpose and death itself stirred from its ancient slumber, the Golden Prince would become the first casualty in a war he never chose to fight. The Night of Black Knives was orchestrated by his own stepsister, Rai the Witch, who sought to free herself from the chains of destiny by stealing a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade. Rand's plan was as clever as it was cruel. She understood that to escape her own fate as an Empyrean bound to serve the greater will, she needed to die in body while preserving her soul. But the cosmic balance demanded a price. If she were to die in flesh, someone else must die in spirit. She chose Godwyn perhaps because he was the most beloved, perhaps because his death would cause the greatest upheaval, or perhaps simply because fate demanded that the purest soul should pay the highest price. The Black Knife assassins, all of them new men like Queen Ma herself, crept into the capital and found Godwyn in the depths of the royal palace. Their blades, imbued with the power of destined death, carved half of the curse mark of death into his back, while Rai simultaneously carved the other half into her own body. In that moment, both died and both lived, but in the worst possible way. Godwyn's body survived, while his soul perished completely, leaving behind a hollow shell that could not truly live, but could not truly die. Rai's soul lived on while her body died, allowing her to escape into the realm of spirits and dolls. The curse mark of death, meant to be a complete circle representing true death, was instead split into 2 crescent moons, creating a perversion of the natural order that would haunt the lands between for ages to come. What happened to Godwyn after his spiritual death represents one of the most horrifying transformations in the law of Elden Ring. Without a soul to guide it, his body began to change in ways that defied both nature and reason. The Golden Prince, once the most beautiful and noble of all demigods, became the Prince of Death. A massive, grotesque creature with fish-like features, scaled skin, and dead eyes that reflected nothing but the void where his soul once dwelt. But the horror of Godwyn's transformation extended far beyond his own suffering. When his body was given the honor of tree burial and laid to rest among the roots of the great tree itself, the corruption of his deathless state began to spread. The tree roots, once pure conduits of the tree's grace, became infected with what scholars call death root, a spreading corruption that gave rise to those who live in death. These undead beings, neither truly alive nor properly deceased, began to proliferate throughout the lands between. Skeletons that should have crumbled to dust instead wandered with malevolent purpose. Spirits that should have passed on to whatever lies beyond became trapped in an endless cycle of pain and confusion. The very concept of death, once cleanly defined by the Golden Order, became mudded and terrible. Even the ancient dragon Fortis, Godwyn's dear friend and companion, was not spared from this spreading corruption. Driven by loyalty and love that transcended species, the great dragon entered Godwyn's death dream, attempting to burn away the death within his friend's body. But the corruption was too strong, too fundamental. Instead of saving Godwyn, Forisax himself became infected, transforming from a majestic ancient dragon into a lick dragon, forever bound to the realm of death and decay. The tragedy deepened when those who loved Godwyn refused to accept his fate. Michaela, his younger half-brother, worked tirelessly with the Knights of Castle Sol to create an eclipse they believed would restore Godwyn's soul to his body. They poured resources and lives into this desperate hope, but their efforts were doomed from the start. The soul that had been destroyed could not be recovered, and their failure only added to the mounting despair that would eventually doom the Hickory as well. The Death Knights, Godwin's most loyal followers, made perhaps the most tragic choice of all. Rather than abandon their lord in his corruption, they chose to follow him into his new existence as the Prince of Death. These noble warriors deliberately embraced the very corruption that others fled from, becoming undead knights in service to their transformed master. They traded their lives, their humanity, and their hope of rest for the chance to remain loyal to the prince they had served in life. As the corruption spread, it became clear that Godwin's death had achieved something terrible that no victory in life could have accomplished. It had broken the fundamental order of existence itself. Death, which had been cleanly removed from the world by Queen Ma's initial reforms, had returned in a form more horrible than its original state. Now, instead of the peace of true death, the lands between knew only the agony of endless undeath. The Golden Prince, who had once been the perfect embodiment of divine rule, had become the perfect embodiment of divine failure. His transformation served as a constant reminder that even the purest of intentions, even the most noble of souls, could be twisted into something monstrous by forces beyond their control. In trying to cheat death, the cosmic powers had created something far worse than death itself. Godwin's story represents the ultimate tragedy of the demigods, that their very nature as divine beings made them vulnerable to corruptions and curses that mortals could never imagine. His fall from Golden Prince to Prince of Death is not just a personal tragedy, but a cosmic one representing the moment when the ordered universe of the Golden Order began its inevitable collapse into chaos and despair. Moving deeper into the golden lineage, we encounter the Omen twins, Morgott and Moog, whose very existence challenged the Golden Order's pretense of purity and perfection. Born to Queen Ma and Godfrey as second and third sons, these children were cursed from the moment of their birth with the mark of the Omen, a condition that covered their bodies with horns and other growths that the Golden Order considered abominable. The tragedy of Morgott and Moog begins with understanding what it meant to be Omen in the lands between. These beings were seen as cursed, their horn-covered bodies viewed as evidence of corruption and divine displeasure. The official doctrine taught that omens were touched by some ancient evil, their very existence a challenge to the ordered perfection that the Golden Order claimed to represent. In truth, their horns and other features were likely remnants of the crucible, the primordial state of life that existed before the current order imposed its rigid structure upon the world. Rather than celebrate these children as links to the world's ancient past, Queen Mara chose to hide them away. Morgott and Moog were secreted beneath the capital city of Lendl, confined to the sewers and forgotten tunnels that lay far from the golden light of the Erd tree. This decision, born of shame and political necessity, would shape both brothers in ways that would echo through the ages. The psychological impact of this abandonment cannot be overstated. These were not merely cast aside nobles, but the direct sons of a goddess and an elder lord, beings whose blood should have guaranteed them places of honor and respect. Instead, they grew up in darkness, surrounded by filth and shadow, knowing that their own mother considered them too shameful to acknowledge publicly. Yet, even in their abandonment, the two brothers chose radically different paths, each representing a different response to the trauma of rejection. Morgott, despite every reason to hate the Golden Order that had cast him aside, became its most devoted defender. In a twisted display of Stockholm Syndrome, he internalized the very prejudices that had been used to justify his exile, believing that his curse made him unworthy of love or acceptance, but that this unworthiness should drive him to serve rather than rebel. Moog, conversely, embraced the darkness that had been forced upon him. If the Golden Order would not accept him, then he would find other gods to serve, other forms of power to pursue. His path led him to the Formless Mother, an outer god associated with blood and formless life, whose gifts came with their own terrible prices. Morgott's story is perhaps the more heartbreaking of the two because of its fundamental irony. Here was a being who, despite facing rejection and abandonment from the very institution he served, became its most stalwart defender. When the shattering occurred and various demigods began fighting over the fragments of the Elden Ring, it was Morgott who emerged from the sewers to defend the capital and the Erd tree itself. He did not do this for personal gain or recognition. Morgott never claimed the throne for himself, never demanded acknowledgement of his royal blood. Instead, he fought because he genuinely believed in the Golden Order's mission, even knowing that it would never truly accept him. He became the protector of a system that had branded him as unworthy of protection. Under the alias of Margit, the fell omen, Morgott defended the tree against all who would approach it without proper authorization. He faced down other demigods, including his own siblings, viewing their attempts to claim the throne as acts of treachery against the proper order. In his mind, he was the sole remaining guardian of legitimacy in a world gone mad with ambition. The cruelest aspect of Morgott's devotion was that it was built upon a foundation of self-hatred. He believed himself to be cursed and unworthy, accepting the Golden Order's judgment of his nature, even as he fought to preserve it. This internalized shame manifested in his inability to see his own worth, his refusal to claim the recognition he had earned through his service, and his treatment of other cursed beings with the same harsh judgment that had been applied to him. When the Tarnished finally faces Morgott in his throne room, the king's dying words reveal the depth of his tragic self-deception. Even in death, he cannot bring himself to curse the order that had rejected him, instead lamenting that he was not worthy to be its true guardian. His loyalty remained absolute even as his life ebbed away, a testament to the psychological damage inflicted by a lifetime of conditional love and systematic devaluation. Moog's path, while more obviously destructive, represents an equally tragic response to the same fundamental rejection. Where Morgott internalized the Golden Order's judgment and sought to prove his worth through service, Moog externalized his pain and sought to build something new from the ruins of his shattered self-worth. His alliance with the formless mother provided him with the power and purpose that the Golden Order had denied him. But it came at a cost that would ultimately consume not just him, but innocent others as well. The blood magic he learned allowed him to create his own realm beneath the earth, a twisted reflection of the golden capital that had rejected him. In his Mojin palace, Omen and other outcasts could find a place of belonging, but only under the dominion of a being whose own trauma had made him incapable of healthy relationships. The most disturbing aspect of Moog's story involves his obsession with his half-brother, Miquella. Perhaps seeing in the eternally youthful Empyrean a chance to claim the divine acceptance that had always been denied to him, Moog kidnapped the slumbering Miquella and attempted to transform him into a god through repeated blood rituals. This grotesque courtship conducted upon an unconscious victim represents the ultimate corruption of Moog's capacity for love and connection. Moog's actions toward Miquella can be understood as a desperate attempt to force the recognition and acceptance he had never received naturally. By making Miquella into a god and positioning himself as that god's consort, he hoped to finally achieve the status and acknowledgement that his royal blood should have granted him from birth. Yet this plan was doomed from the start, built as it was upon violence, violation, and the fundamental misunderstanding that forced love could ever be real or satisfying. The blood dynasty that Mog created in the depths of his underground realm became a mirror of his own psychological state, a place where power was exercised through pain, where loyalty was maintained through fear, and where the wounds of the past were perpetually reopened rather than allowed to heal. His followers, drawn from among society's outcasts and rejects, found in him a leader who understood their pain, but who could offer them only more pain in return. The ultimate tragedy of both Omen twins lies in the waste of their potential. Morgott possessed the strength and wisdom to rule justly, as evidenced by his successful defense of Lendel, and his ability to see through the pretensions of other claimants to the throne. Moog demonstrated incredible magical aptitude and organizational skills in creating his underground dynasty. Either brother could have been a force for positive change in the lands between, But the Golden Order's rejection had so thoroughly warped their self-perception that they could only exist in relation to the system that had hurt them. Their stories serve as a damning indictment of the Golden Order's claims to righteousness and perfection. A truly just system would have found ways to accommodate and celebrate the diversity represented by Omen children, recognizing their unique gifts rather than simply casting them aside. Instead, by treating these divine-blooded princes as shameful secrets, the Golden Order created two of its most implacable enemies. One who defended it out of twisted loyalty, and one who sought to destroy it out of well-earned hatred. The final member of Godfrey's line deserving mention is Godric the Grafted. Though his blood connection to the divine lineage had become so diluted over the generations that he could barely claim legitimacy as a demigod at all, Godric represents the end point of a noble bloodline's decay, showing how divine heritage can become a burden rather than a blessing when it is no longer sufficient to meet the expectations it creates. Godric's tragedy lies in his acute awareness of his own inadequacy. As a distant descendant of Godwyn the Golden, he bore a name and heritage that promised greatness, but lacked the power to live up to those promises. This mismatch between expectation and reality drove him to increasingly desperate measures, culminating in his practice of grafting the limbs and organs of other beings onto his own body in a futile attempt to literally acquire the strength he had not inherited naturally. The practice of grafting represents one of the most visceral expressions of self-hatred in all of Elden Ring's law. Unable to accept his limitations or find alternative sources of worth, Godric chose to mutilate himself repeatedly, adding pieces of others to his body in the hope that quantity might somehow compensate for quality. Each new limb grafted onto his form was both an admission of inadequacy and a desperate grasp for relevance. His political and military failures only compounded his psychological struggles. During the shattering, Godric lost battle after battle, suffering humiliating defeats at the hands of other demigods, including Millennia and Morgott. These losses, rather than teaching him humility or encouraging him to find different paths to meaning, only drove him to more extreme measures. He began grafting not just willing volunteers, but unwilling victims, turning his court into a channel house of surgical horror. The grotesque irony of Godric's situation was that his very attempts to gain strength made him weaker. Each new graft required energy to maintain, created new vulnerabilities, and further removed him from any coherent sense of self. He became a living patchwork, a creature defined not by what he was, but by what he had taken from others. In trying to become everything, he became nothing. When the Tarnished finally faces Godric in his castle, they encounter not a mighty demigod, but a pathetic creature so desperate for validation that he resorts to grafting a dragon head onto his own arm in the middle of their battle. This final act of self-mutilation, performed in full view of his enemy, represents the complete breakdown of whatever dignity or self-respect he might once have possessed. Godric's death brings no great revelation or tragic recognition, no moment of clarity or redemption. He simply dies as he lived, grasping desperately for power that was never meant for him, unable to understand that his true tragedy lay not in his weakness, but in his inability to accept and work within his limitations. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of measuring one's worth entirely in comparison to the achievements of one's ancestors. The Carrion bloodline presents a different but equally tragic set of stories. Born from the union of Rathagen and Queen Rinnel, these children found themselves caught between two worlds: the mystical realm of lunar sorcery and cosmic observation that their mother represented, and the golden order of earthly dominion that their father served. This divided heritage would prove to be both a source of great power and the foundation of great suffering for all three of Rinnel's children. Rani, the witch, the eldest and perhaps most complex of the Carrion children, represents the demigod who chose to reject divinity itself rather than accept the constraints it imposed. Born as Lunar Princess Rai, she was marked as an Empyrean, one of the few beings capable of succeeding Queen Ma as a vessel for the Elden Ring and the god it contained. Yet rather than seeing this as a blessing, Rai understood it as a sentence to eternal servitude to cosmic forces beyond her control. The tragedy of Rai's situation was that her very potential for greatness made her a prisoner. As an Empyrean, she was constantly watched by her two fingers, celestial entities that served as intermediaries for the greater will. Every aspect of her future was planned, her role in the cosmic order predetermined. She was to be a vessel, a conduit for divine, rather than an individual with her own desires and aspirations. This realization drove Rai to orchestrate perhaps the most complex and far-reaching act of rebellion in the history of the lands between the Night of Black Knives. Her plan required not just the death of her own physical body, but the sacrifice of an innocent soul, her stepbrother, Godwyn. The moral weight of this decision cannot be understated. Rani chose to murder a beloved family member to secure her own freedom. The theft of the Rune of Death from Malekth, the Black Blade, was itself a monumental undertaking, requiring her to outmaneuver one of the most powerful entities in the lands between. The creation of the Black Knife Assassins, all Numen women with connections to Queen Ma herself, suggests a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the Golden Order. The precision required to split the curse mark of death between herself and Godwyn speaks to magical knowledge of the highest order. Yet, even as Rai succeeded in her immediate goal of freeing herself from the greater will's influence. The cost of her actions echoed through the ages. Godwyn's corruption spread throughout the lands between, creating countless undead and perverting the natural order of death itself. The shattering that followed would claim countless lives and reduce a prosperous realm to ruins. Rai had chosen personal freedom over collective well-being, a decision that speaks to both her tremendous strength of will and her moral limitations. After achieving her spiritual freedom, Rani faced the challenge of existing as a disembodied soul in a world that expected her to have physical form. Her solution was to inhabit a series of dolls crafted in her image. But this existence came with its own constraints. She could interact with the world only in limited ways, dependent on the cooperation of others to achieve her goals. Forever reminded of what she had sacrificed to gain her freedom. The irony of Rai's situation is that in rejecting one form of servitude, she may have simply chosen another. Her quest to establish an age of stars, where the influence of outer gods would be removed from the world, entirely requires her to become a god herself, the very role she initially rejected. Whether this represents wisdom gained through experience, or simply the inescapable nature of power in the cosmic order, remains a matter of interpretation. Her relationships with others became colored by her fundamental isolation. As a being who had literally killed to avoid the constraints of destiny, Rai found it difficult to form genuine connections with others. Her interactions with the tarnished, while ultimately beneficial to both parties, are marked by manipulation and careful calculation rather than spontaneous trust or affection. She had gained the freedom to choose her own path, but lost the simple ability to be vulnerable with others. The tragic aspect of Rai's story lies not in any particular failure or doom, but in the fact that her very success required her to become something less than fully alive. In choosing freedom over servitude, she chose isolation over connection, possibility over certainty. Whether this trade was ultimately worthwhile depends on one's perspective on the value of individual autonomy versus collective belonging. Star's scourge Raiden presents the tragedy of a hero whose very virtues became the instruments of his destruction. The second child of Raidegen and Renala, Raiden embodied the warrior ideals of his time, growing to become one of the mightiest demigods in both physical strength and magical prowess. His mastery of gravity magic allowed him to continue riding his beloved steed Torrent, even as he grew to enormous size. A touching detail that speaks to his fundamental kindness and loyalty. Raiden's early life was marked by admiration for Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, whose example inspired him to pursue excellence in warfare and leadership. This admiration was not mere hero worship, but represented a genuine attempt to embody the virtues of honor, strength, and protection of the innocent that Godfrey had exemplified during his reign. Radon's red man and lion-like bearing consciously echoed his hero's appearance, marking him as a spiritual successor to the greatest warrior of the previous generation. The general's legendary battle against the falling stars represents the pinnacle of his power and the beginning of his doom. Using his gravity magic, Raiden literally fought against cosmic forces, holding back the stars themselves to protect the lands between from whatever catastrophe their descent might bring. This feat required not just immense power, but constant vigilance. The stars remained suspended only as long as Raiden maintained his magical grip upon them. This act of cosmic heroism came with a terrible price. The constant strain of holding back the stars began to consume Raiden from within, requiring more and more of his energy and attention. He became locked in an eternal battle against forces that would resume their destructive course the moment his concentration faltered. In protecting the world from cosmic catastrophe, he had sentenced himself to a form of eternal vigilance that would ultimately break his mind. The festival of combat that preceded the shattering represented Raiden's attempt to find meaning and purpose despite his burden. These grand tournaments allowed him to test his skills against worthy opponents while providing entertainment and inspiration to his people. The festival became a symbol of Raiden's leadership style. He led not through fear or manipulation, but through example, showing others what heights of achievement were possible through dedication and training. When the shattering began and the demigods went to war over the fragments of the Elden Ring, Raiden found himself facing an impossible choice. His sister Ronnie had orchestrated the events that led to the conflict. Yet, he could not bring himself to oppose her directly. His military genius and personal power made him a natural leader in any conflict. Yet he had no personal ambition for the throne that drove others to terrible extremes. The battle between Raiden and Millennia in the Khalid Wilds represents one of the most tragic encounters in the entire Shattering War. These two demigods, both paragons of their respective virtues, met in single combat that neither truly wanted. Raiden fought with all his skill and might, but Millennia possessed a weapon he could not counter, the scarlet rot that consumed her from within. When Millennia unleashed the first bloom of her scarlet rot, transforming the entire region of Khalid into a corrupted wasteland, she did not do so out of malice, but out of desperation. The rot that plagued her body had been held in check through sheer force of will. But the strain of her battle with Raiden finally overwhelmed her defenses. In that moment, she became something she had always fought against, a vector for the very corruption she had spent her life resisting. The rot that consumed Raiden did not kill him, but rather robbed him of everything that made him who he was. His mighty intellect, capable of calculating the movements of celestial bodies and coordinating massive armies, crumbled under the influence of the cosmic plague. His memories of love and duty faded, leaving behind only base instincts and endless hunger. The noble general became a rabid beast, roaming the wastes of Khalid in search of anything that might satisfy his corrupted appetites. Yet even in his madness, traces of Radon's former nobility remained. He continued to hold back the stars, his commitment to protecting the world so fundamental that it survived even the destruction of his conscious mind. His horse Torrent, though reduced to little more than bones by the rot, was still tenderly cared for by the maddened general. These small gestures of continuity made his fall all the more heartbreaking, showing glimpses of the hero he had been through the monster he had become. The Festival of Radon, organized by his remaining loyal followers after his corruption, represents perhaps the most tragic celebration in all of fiction. These warriors and scholars who had served under Raiden in his glory days chose to honor their general's memory by arranging for his death at the hands of worthy opponents. They understood that the being rampaging through Khalid was no longer their beloved leader, but could not bring themselves to simply abandon him to his corruption. When mighty warriors gather to participate in the festival, they do so not out of bloodlust or desire for glory, but out of respect for what Radin had been and compassion for what he had become. The festival represents a form of mercy killing, a final gift to a hero who had given everything in service to others and deserved better than to spend eternity as a mindless beast. The irony of Raiden's fate is that his very virtues, his strength, his dedication, his refusal to abandon his responsibilities, even when they consumed him, made his fall inevitable. A lesser being might have found some way to compromise, to share the burden of holding back the stars, or to accept help from others. But Raiden's hero's pride and genuine love for the world made him unable to consider any solution that might put others at risk. In the end, Raiden's death brings both tragedy and relief. The stars he had held back for so long finally resume their courses, bringing whatever fate they carry with them. But the noble general is finally freed from his burden of pain and madness, allowed to rest after a lifetime of service and an eternity of suffering. His story serves as a meditation on the price of heroism and the tragic inevitability that awaits those who sacrifice everything for others. The youngest of Renala's children, Priya Rykard, followed a path that led from noble ideals to monstrous corruption, representing perhaps the clearest example of how good intentions can lead to ultimate damnation. Rykard began his career as a prior of the Golden Order, a position that required both legal expertise and moral authority. He was tasked with upholding the laws and principles that governed the lands between, a role that should have placed him firmly on the side of justice and order. Yet, Reichard's intimate knowledge of the law revealed to him its fundamental hypocrisies and limitations. He saw how the Golden Order's high-minded principles were applied selectively, how justice was often subordinated to political expediency, and how the system he served ultimately protected the interests of the powerful at the expense of the weak. This disillusionment set him on a path toward increasingly radical solutions to the problems he observed. His involvement in the Night of Black Knives conspiracy, though secondary to his sister Rye's role, marked his first major break with the established order. By providing logistical support and protection for the operation, Reichard demonstrated his willingness to work outside the law he had sworn to uphold. This decision, perhaps made with the best of intentions, opened a door that could never be closed again. The establishment of Volcano Manor as a refuge for those who opposed the Golden Order reflected Reichard's genuine desire to create an alternative to the system he had come to despise. The manor became a haven for outcasts, rebels, and those who had been wronged by the established order. Here, former knights who had lost faith in their oaths could find new purpose. Scholars whose ideas had been deemed heretical could pursue their research, and common folk who had been crushed by the system could find protection and community. Yet, even as Reichard built his alternative community, he was drawn toward increasingly extreme measures in his pursuit of the power necessary to challenge the Golden Order directly. His research into blasphemous sorceries led him to make contact with entities and forces that existed outside the cosmic order entirely. These investigations, conducted with the methodical thoroughness of his legal training, gradually wore away at his moral boundaries and sense of proportion. The transformation of Volcano Manor itself reflects Reichard's gradual descent into moral compromise. What began as a scholarly retreat where dissident could safely discuss alternative philosophies slowly became a training ground for assassins and rebels. The Mana's libraries, once filled with treatises on law and justice, accumulated forbidden texts on dark magic and the summoning of entities from beyond the stars. Reichard's followers during this period included some of the most brilliant and disillusioned minds of their generation. Knights who had witnessed the Golden Order's hypocrisy firsthand, scholars whose research had been suppressed for challenging orthodox doctrine, and common folk who had suffered under the weight of unjust laws, all found sanctuary within his halls. Yet their very presence created a pressure for Reichard to deliver on his promises of meaningful change. The establishment of the recusant organization marked Reichard's formal break with any pretense of working within existing systems. These assassins, recruited from among his most devoted followers, were tasked with eliminating key figures who supported the Golden Order's continued dominance. Each successful assassination was both a victory for Reichard's cause, and a step further away from the legal principles he had once sworn to uphold. The psychological toll of orchestrating these killings weighed heavily on Reichard, despite his intellectual justification for their necessity. He had begun his career believing in the power of law and reason to create positive change, only to find himself ordering murders and celebrating the destruction of the very institutions he had once served. This cognitive dissonance created a fundamental instability in his worldview that made him vulnerable to more extreme solutions. The study of forbidden magics opened doorways in Reichard's mind that could never be closed again. Each new spell mastered, each new entity contacted, expanded his understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality, while simultaneously corrupting his perspective on right and wrong. The knowledge he gained came with its own hunger, demanding ever greater sacrifices and more terrible risks to achieve meaningful power. His correspondence with entities from beyond the known cosmos reveals the gradual erosion of his human perspective. Early letters show a scholar seeking knowledge, asking careful questions about the nature of reality and the possibility of alternative orders. Later communications read like the writings of someone whose very sense of self has been compromised, speaking in terms and concepts that no purely human mind could comfortably contain. The recruitment of Tanith as his consort represents both Reichard's need for human connection and his inability to maintain relationships uncontaminated by his growing obsession with power. Tanith's devotion to him was genuine, but it was devotion to a being who was no longer entirely human, whose goals had become so abstract and cosmic that they barely related to the original injustices that had motivated his rebellion. The installation of the god-devouring serpent within Volcano Manor marked the point of no return in Reich's transformation. This ancient entity capable of literally consuming divine essence represented power of a scale that could genuinely challenge the cosmic order itself. Yet its very presence within his stronghold began to influence everyone who came into contact with it, gradually converting his community of idealistic rebels into a cult centered around feeding the serpent's endless appetite. The corruption was subtle at first, manifesting as an increased tolerance for violence, a growing appetite for conflict, and a gradual shift in priorities from protecting the innocent to simply opposing authority. Members of the community who had joined to fight for justice found themselves participating in acts of increasing brutality, each justified as necessary for the greater cause, but collectively representing a fundamental betrayal of their original values. Reichard's own relationship with the serpent began as that of a scholar studying a fascinating specimen, but gradually evolved into something approaching worship. The entity's vast knowledge of cosmic forces and its complete disregard for conventional morality offered him perspectives that his legal training could never have provided. Yet each conversation with the creature left him a little less human, a little more willing to consider solutions that his former self would have found abhorrent. The philosophical corruption preceded the physical transformation by years. Long before Reich had offered his body to the serpent, his mind had already been consumed by its alien logic. He had come to believe that the only way to truly change the world was to destroy it completely and rebuild it according to principles derived from entities that existed outside the current cosmic order entirely. The final ritual in which Reichard allowed himself to be devoured by the god-devouring serpent was not an act of desperation, but the culmination of a long philosophical journey. He had convinced himself that by merging with the entity, he could retain his intelligence and moral purpose while gaining the power necessary to reshape reality itself. The tragedy was not that he was wrong about gaining power, but that he had fundamentally misunderstood what that power would cost him. The being that emerged from this merger retained Reichard's memories and intelligence, but had lost the capacity for the compassion and justice that had originally motivated his rebellion. The god-devouring serpent's influence was not limited to granting power. It fundamentally altered the priorities and perspectives of anything that merged with it. Reichard's noble goals of creating a more just world were replaced by the serpent's simple desire to consume everything that existed. The physical transformation was horrifying in its completeness. Reichard's human form was not simply destroyed, but integrated into the serpent's massive body, creating a chimeric being that was neither fully human nor fully serpent. His face, still recognizable, but twisted into something alien and terrible, emerged from the creature's neck like a grotesque ornament, retaining the power of speech, but using it only to express the serpent's hunger for destruction. The effect on his followers was immediate and devastating. Those who had joined his cause out of genuine idealism were horrified by what their leader had become, while those whose own moral boundaries had been eroded by years of increasingly extreme actions embraced the transformation as the logical conclusion of their rebellion. The community split between those who fled in terror and those who chose to serve the monstrous being their leader had become. Tanith's response to Reichard's transformation reveals the depth of psychological manipulation that the serpent's influence had achieved. Rather than being repulsed by what her consort had become, she embraced it as the fulfillment of his destiny. Organizing the remaining members of Volcano Mana around the goal of feeding the serpent god and expanding its influence, her devotion, once directed toward a man with noble goals, became redirected toward a monster whose only purpose was consumption. The perversion of Volcano Manor's original mission became complete with with Rykard's transformation. What had begun as a refuge for those seeking justice became a den of creatures whose only goal was to lure more victims into their master's maw. The philosophical discussions that had once filled the manor's halls were replaced by planning sessions focused on identifying and capturing suitable prey for the god-devouring serpent. The tragic irony of Rykard's ultimate fate is that he achieved exactly what he had set out to accomplish. He gained the power to challenge the cosmic order and potentially reshape the world according to his will. Yet in gaining that power, he had lost everything that made him human, everything that had justified his original rebellion. The serpent god that bore his face and memories was capable of destroying the Golden Order, but it was equally capable of destroying everything else, making it a threat to the very people he had originally sought to protect. His final words to those who would challenge him reveal the complete corruption of his original ideals. No longer speaking of justice or reform, he invites others to join his family of consumed beings, offering them the same false promise of power and purpose that had once seduced him. The idealistic Pry, who had once sought to create a better world, had become a recruiter for cosmic horror, using his intelligence not to build, but only to destroy. The legacy of Rykard's transformation extends beyond his personal tragedy to encompass everyone who had believed in his cause. The knights and scholars who had followed him, believing they were working toward a more just world, found themselves either dead, fled, or corrupted into servants of a cosmic horror. Their idealism had been weaponized against them, turned into a tool for their own destruction. The ultimate lesson of Rykard's story is not simply that power corrupts, but that certain forms of power are inherently corrupting, changing not just behavior, but fundamental nature. The god-devouring serpent represented knowledge and abilities that human consciousness was never meant to contain. And the attempt to merge with such forces inevitably destroyed the very humanity that had made the original goals meaningful. His transformation serves as a warning about the dangers of pursuing radical solutions to systemic problems without carefully considering the costs of those solutions. Rykard's analysis of the Golden Order's flaws was largely correct, and his desire to create alternatives was admirable. But his willingness to embrace any means necessary to achieve his ends ultimately made him a greater threat than the system he had sought to replace. The empty halls of Volcano Mana, now populated by nightmarish creatures devoted to feeding their serpentine master, stand as a monument to the corruption of noble ideals. The books on law and justice that once filled its libraries have been replaced by blasphemous texts on consumption and destruction. The community of idealistic rebels has become a cult of cosmic horror. The refugee for the oppressed has become a trap for the innocent. In the end, Rykard's story represents the ultimate cautionary tale about the seductive nature of power and the ease with which noble goals can be perverted into their opposite. His transformation from idealistic reformer to cosmic horror was not the result of a single moment of weakness, but the culmination of a series of seemingly justified compromises, each one making the next step easier to rationalize, until he had traveled so far from his starting point that return was impossible. Moving beyond the children of the major lineages, we must examine the broader tragedy that encompasses all of the demigods collectively, the shattering itself. This catastrophic war was not simply a political conflict over succession, but a manifestation of the deep psychological wounds that had been inflicted upon an entire generation of divine-blooded beings. The shattering began not with the breaking of the Elden Ring, but with the breaking of the family bonds that should have united Queen Ma's children. Each demigod entered the conflict carrying the weight of their own personal tragedies, their own curses and disappointments, their own desperate need for validation and meaning. The war became not just a struggle for political power, but a forum for working out generations of accumulated family trauma on a cosmic scale. The irony of the shattering is that it was triggered by an act of mercy. When Queen Ma shattered the Elder Ring following Godwin's assassination, she was acting not as a calculating politician, but as a grieving mother whose heart had been broken by the loss of her most beloved child. Yet this expression of maternal anguish created the very conditions that would lead to the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The distribution of the great runes among her surviving children represented both an opportunity and a curse. Each fragment of the shattered Elder Ring carried immense power, enough to transform its bearer into something approaching a god. Yet that same power came with a terrible price. It amplified every existing flaw and obsession in its wielder, turning personal struggles into cosmic catastrophes. Godric's possession of a great rune transformed his feelings of inadequacy into a desperate need to literally remake himself through grafting. The power should have been enough to make him a formidable leader, but instead, it became fuel for his self-destructive attempts to become something he was never meant to be. Radon's great rune amplified his heroic nature, but also his burden. The constant strain of holding back the stars became even more crushing under the weight of cosmic power, contributing to his eventual mental breakdown. Even before millennia's, Rot claimed his sanity entirely. Rykard's great rune provided him with the influence necessary to build his community at Volcano Manor. But it also made the god-devouring serpent's whispers more seductive, accelerating his journey toward damnation. By giving him the confidence to believe he could control forces beyond his understanding, Millennia's great rune gave her the strength to become an unparalleled warrior. But it also made her scarlet rot more virulent and harder to control. The same power that made her capable of protecting Michaela also made her a greater threat to everything around her. Morgott's great rune allowed him to become an effective defender of the capital, but it also reinforced his obsessive loyalty to a system that had never truly accepted him, making it impossible for him to see the fundamental flaws in what he was protecting. Moog's great rune enhanced his blood magic and allowed him to create his underground dynasty. But it also fed his unhealthy obsession with Michaela and his delusions about forcing love through magical compulsion. The war that followed was not a conventional conflict between rational actors pursuing clear political goals, but a manifestation of collective mental illness on a cosmic scale. Each demigod fought not just for the throne, but for validation of their own worth, for proof that their suffering had meaning, for the chance to reshape the world according to their own traumatized understanding of what order should look like. The battles of the Shattering were marked by a level of brutality and destruction that went far beyond what would have been necessary for mere political victory. Entire regions were laid waste, not because they held strategic value, but because the demigods' psychological wounds demanded total destruction of anything that reminded them of their pain. The transformation of Khalid during the battle between Millennia and Raiden exemplifies this dynamic. Both combatants possessed the power to end their conflict through less destructive means, but their personal obsessions, Millennia's devotion to Makilla, Raiden's heroic pride, drove them to extremes that devastated an entire region and its innocent inhabitants. The siege of Lendl saw brother fighting brother, with Morgott defending the capital against his own siblings, not out of personal animosity, but out of his pathological need to prove his worth to a system that had never valued him. The sight of the Omen King standing alone against multiple demigod armies speaks to both his incredible dedication and his tragic inability to see that his loyalty was misplaced. The involvement of external forces in the conflict, the various knights, soldiers, and scholars who aligned themselves with different demigods, created a cascade of suffering that extended far beyond the divine family itself. Mortal beings found themselves caught up in conflicts they could barely understand, fighting wars over cosmic principles that had little bearing on their daily lives. The Cleanroot Knights, who served Millennia, demonstrated incredible loyalty to their mistress, willingly accepting infection with her scarlet rot rather than abandon her cause. Their sacrifice was noble, but it also represented the way that the demigods' personal struggles consumed everyone around them, turning devoted followers into victims of the very leaders they sought to serve. The Cuckoo Knights, who remained loyal to Renala after Radigan's abandonment, found themselves defending a queen whose mind had been shattered by grief, fighting for a cause that no longer had any clear meaning or purpose. Their continued service speaks to admirable loyalty, but also to the tragic waste of dedication applied to hopeless causes. The various lesser nobles and regional leaders who chose sides in the conflict often did so based on incomplete information or personal relationships rather than any clear understanding of what victory would actually mean. The war became a consuming force that drew in anyone with power or influence, regardless of their personal connection to the original grievances. The economic and social devastation caused by the prolonged conflict created secondary waves of suffering that may have exceeded even the direct casualties of battle. Trade networks collapsed, leaving entire communities without access to essential goods. Agricultural regions were abandoned as farmers fled the fighting, leading to widespread famine. The infrastructure of civilization itself began to crumble under the weight of endless war. The psychological impact on the surviving population was equally devastating. Generations grew up knowing only war, with no memory of the peace and prosperity that had once characterized the lands between under unified rule. The very concept of stable government became alien to people who had lived their entire lives watching divine rulers destroy each other and everything around them. The rise of various cults and alternative belief systems during this period reflects the population's desperate search for meaning in a world where the traditional sources of authority had proven themselves unworthy of trust. The worship of outer gods, the embrace of nihilistic philosophies, and the turn toward increasingly extreme forms of religious expression all represent attempts to find some form of spiritual stability in a reality that seemed to have lost all coherent structure. The emergence of those who live in death as a significant presence throughout the lands between during this period was not coincidental. The corruption spreading from Godwin's remains was amplified by the psychological and spiritual chaos of the shattering, creating conditions where the boundaries between life and death became increasingly meaningless. The various attempts by different factions to end the conflict through negotiation or compromise all failed because the demigods' personal traumas made genuine reconciliation impossible. Each side demanded not just political victory, but psychological validation, recognition that their suffering had been justified and their cause righteous. Since these needs were fundamentally incompatible, no diplomatic solution could address the underlying issues driving the conflict. The involvement of outside forces, the various outer gods, the greater was withdrawal of support. The emanations of entities like the formless mother transformed what had begun as a family dispute into a cosmic conflict, with implications far beyond the lands between itself. The demigods became proxies in struggles between forces they barely understood. Their personal pain, weaponized by entities whose goals had nothing to do with their well-being. The gradual exhaustion of all sides in the conflict created a stalemate that was perhaps worse than outright victory by any single faction would have been. The lands between became a realm where war was constant but inconclusive, where suffering continued indefinitely without the possibility of resolution through victory or defeat. The arrival of the Tarnished represents not a natural evolution of the conflict, but an external intervention by forces that had grown tired of the stalemate. The Greater Will's decision to recall the exiled Tarnished and task them with claiming the Elden Ring was essentially an admission that the demigods had proven themselves incapable of resolving their differences through their own efforts. Yet, even this intervention carries its own tragic implications. The Tarnished's quest requires them to kill or defeat the very demigods whose suffering had created the crisis in the first place. Victory for the Tarnished means the final destruction of Queen Ma's family, the complete failure of her experiment in creating divine rulers capable of maintaining cosmic order. The various endings available to the Tarnished player represent different philosophical approaches to resolving the crisis, but none of them can truly undo the damage that has been done. Whether the player chooses to restore the old order, create a new one, or abandon the concept of cosmic governance entirely, the fundamental tragedy remains. An entire generation of divine beings destroyed themselves and their world in pursuit of love and validation that was never truly available to them. The empty thrones scattered throughout the lands between serve as monuments to this collective failure. Each abandoned palace and ruined fortress represents not just a military defeat, but a personal tragedy, a life consumed by forces too great for any individual to control or understand. In examining the children born of Queen Mika's various unions, we see reflected the fundamental tensions inherent in attempting to create beings capable of bridging the gap between divine purpose and human need. Each lineage represents a different approach to this impossible task, and each demonstrates the ways in which divine blood can become a curse rather than a blessing. The golden lineage, born of Ma's union with Godfrey, was intended to embody the pure ideal of divine rule. These children were meant to represent the perfect fusion of cosmic authority and earthly leadership. Beings capable of maintaining order through strength tempered by wisdom. Yet the very purity of their conception made them vulnerable to corruption and exploitation by forces that operated outside the moral frameworks they were raised to respect. Godwin's perfection made him a target for those who sought to disrupt the cosmic order. His nobility and trustworthiness, which should have been sources of strength, became weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The assassination that claimed his soul was successful precisely because he was incapable of imagining that someone would violate the fundamental bonds of family and divine order to achieve political goals. The Omen twins' rejection by the very system they were born to serve reveals the Golden Order's fundamental hypocrisy and its inability to live up to its own stated ideals. Morgott and Murg were denied the love and acceptance that should have been their birthright, not because of anything they had done, but simply because their appearance challenged the Order's pretense of aesthetic perfection. Godric's diluted heritage and resulting inadequacy demonstrate the problems inherent in any system that bases legitimacy on bloodline rather than merit. His desperate attempts to literally rebuild himself through grafting represent the logical extreme of a worldview that reduces personal worth to inherited characteristics rather than individual achievement or moral character. The Carian bloodline born of Rathagen's union with Renala represents the attempt to bridge the gap between cosmic order and intellectual curiosity. These children inherited both the mystical wisdom of their mother's lunar traditions and the militant purpose of their father's service to the Golden Order. Yet this dual heritage created internal conflicts that none of them could fully resolve. Rye's rebellion against her destined role as an Empyrean was driven by her inherited intellectual independence, but it required her to sacrifice the human connections that her Carian heritage valued. Her success in freeing herself from cosmic servitude came at the cost of becoming fundamentally isolated from the world she sought to influence. Rodden's attempt to embody the heroic ideals of both his parents led him to take on burdens that no single being should have carried. His dedication to protecting the world through his mastery of gravity magic was admirable, but it ultimately consumed him from within, leaving him vulnerable to the very forces he had dedicated his life to opposing. Reichard's journey from idealistic reformer to cosmic horror represents the dark side of the Karen intellectual tradition. His inherited curiosity and analytical skills, combined with his father's militant purpose, led him to pursue knowledge and power without sufficient consideration of their moral implications. The very qualities that made him an effective legal scholar and political organizer also made him susceptible to corruption by entities whose logic transcended human moral categories. The twin prodigies, born of Ma's union with her own other self, represent the most ambitious attempt to create perfect divine beings. These children inherited the full power of both aspects of their divine parent, making them theoretically capable of reshaping reality itself according to their will. Yet this very perfection made them targets for cosmic forces that sought to use their power for their own purposes. Michaela's curse of eternal youth prevented him from growing into his full potential as both a leader and a magical researcher. his inability to physically mature created a fundamental disconnect between his intellectual development and his social presence, making it difficult for others to take him seriously as an authority figure, despite his obvious brilliance and good intentions. Millennia's affliction with scarlet rot turned her into a walking weapon of mass destruction, making her very presence a threat to everything and everyone she sought to protect. Her greatest acts of love and loyalty, her willingness to fight for Michaela's cause, became also her greatest failures, as the corruption she carried inevitably spread to innocent bystanders. The psychological pressure created by being born as twins with complementary curses created a codependent relationship that, while touching in its devotion, also limited both children's ability to develop as independent individuals. Each defined themselves primarily in relation to the other, making it impossible for either to find complete fulfillment or self-acceptance. Mesma's exile to the land of shadow represents the ultimate expression of Queen Ma's willingness to sacrifice her children's well-being for political necessity. His curse, while different from those afflicting the other children, was equally limiting in its effects on his ability to live a normal life or form healthy relationships. The pattern that emerges from examining all these stories is one of beings created with tremendous potential, but placed in situations where that potential could never be fully realized. Each demigod possessed qualities that, under different circumstances, could have made them forces for tremendous good in the world. Yet, the very system that created them also ensured their destruction. The cosmic forces that shaped the demigods' fates, the outer gods, the greater will, the ancient entities that predated the current order, viewed these divine-blooded beings not as individuals deserving of love and respect, but as tools to be used in pursuit of abstract goals. The personal happiness and well-being of the demigods was never a consideration in the cosmic calculus that determined their roles and limitations. Queen Ma's own transformation from a mortal woman into a divine vessel represents the original tragedy that shaped all subsequent events. Her loss of individual identity and human perspective, while granting her cosmic power, also made her incapable of the genuine maternal love that her children desperately needed. Her relationships with her offspring became transactional rather than emotional, focused on their utility rather than their welfare. The greater will's decision to withdraw support from the demigods when they failed to meet its expectations reveals the fundamentally exploitative nature of divine authority in the lands between. The cosmic order was never designed to serve the needs of the beings it claimed to govern, but rather to use them as instruments for maintaining stability and control. The various outer gods that influence different demigods, the god of scarlet rot, the formless mother, the frenzied flame, represent alternative forms of cosmic authority that were equally exploitative in their own ways. These entities offered power and purpose to beings who had been rejected by the established order. But their gifts came with prices that ultimately proved even more destructive than the original rejections. The fundamental tragedy of the demigods lies not in any particular failure or weakness on their part, but in the impossibility of the situation they were placed in. They were created to be bridges between cosmic order and human need. But the very forces that granted them divine power also made it impossible for them to maintain their humanity. Their stories serve as a collective meditation on the nature of power, family, and the price of attempting to transcend human limitations. Each individual tragedy reinforces the broader theme that some burdens are too great for any being to bear, regardless of their strength or nobility of purpose. The empty palaces and ruined strongholds that dot the landscape of the lands between stand as monuments not just to political failure, but to the fundamental impossibility of the demigod situation. These structures, once meant to house divine rulers capable of bridging heaven and earth, now serve only as reminders of the price paid for attempting to create beings who could serve purposes beyond their nature. The continuing influence of the demigods' actions long after their deaths or defeats speaks to the cosmic scale of their struggles. The corruption spreading from Godwin's remains, the rot blooming in Khalid, the nightmarish transformations at Volcano Mana, all represent the ways in which their personal tragedies continue to shape the world, ensuring that their suffering will never be forgotten or overcome. To truly understand the depth of these tragedies, we must examine not only the demigods themselves, but the countless lives that were touched, shaped, and often destroyed by their struggles. Every knight who served them, every scholar who studied under them, every common person who lived in their domains became part of their story, often paying prices they never chose to pay for conflicts they barely understood. The clean wrought knights who served millennia represent perhaps the most poignant example of this collateral tragedy. These warriors, drawn from the finest soldiers of their generation, willingly accepted infection with the scarlet rot rather than abandoned their mistress in her time of need. Their transformation from proud knights into plague bearers was not the result of any failing on their part, but simply the inevitable consequence of loving someone who carried cosmic destruction within her very being. The process of becoming a clean wrought knight was not a single moment of infection, but a gradual transformation that could take months or even years to complete. These warriors watched their own bodies slowly succumb to the same corruption that plagued their beloved commander, experiencing firsthand the constant pain and degradation that she had endured since birth. Yet rather than fleeing or seeking cures, they embraced their transformation as a form of communion with her suffering. The psychological impact of this willing corruption cannot be overstated. These knights had to watch their flesh rot away, their limbs become twisted and weak, their very identities subsumed into the spreading plague. Yet, they maintained their loyalty and dedication, even as they lost everything that had once defined them as human beings. Their armor, crafted from unalloyed gold to slow the rot's progression, became both protection and prison, a constant reminder of what they had sacrificed for love. The relationship between Melania and her knights transcended normal military hierarchy, becoming something approaching a family bond forged in shared suffering. She understood their pain because it was her own pain, and they understood her burden because they had chosen to bear a portion of it themselves. This mutual understanding created a loyalty that went far beyond duty or honor, becoming something closer to religious devotion. When Melania fell into her coma after the battle with Raiden, the clean wrought knights faced an impossible choice. Their mistress lay unconscious, possibly dying, while the rot within their own bodies continued its relentless progression. They could have fled, seeking treatment for themselves, or simply trying to live out their remaining days in whatever comfort they could find. Instead, they chose to remain, maintaining vigil over her sleeping form while their own conditions deteriorated. The sight of these once proud warriors reduced to shambling figures whose bodies barely functioned, still maintaining perfect formation around their commander's resting place, represents one of the most heartbreaking images in all of gaming. Their dedication had become both beautiful and horrible, a testament to the power of love and the tragedy of circumstances that made such love destructive. Clean rot. Knight Finley's journey to carry the unconscious Melania back to the hick tree stands as perhaps the greatest act of heroism in the entire shattering war. Alone, infected with rot, carrying a burden nearly as heavy as herself, she traversed the dangerous wastes of Khalid while fighting off constant attacks from the creatures that now populated the corrupted landscape. Her success in this seemingly impossible task speaks to the superhuman dedication that love could inspire, even in a dying body. Yet, even Finley's triumph carried its own tragedy. She delivered her mistress safely to the hick tree, only to discover that the very brother Melania had fought to protect was gone, kidnapped while she had been away proving her devotion. Her greatest achievement had come too late to matter, her sacrifice rendered meaningless by circumstances beyond her control. The other clean-wrought knights who remained at the hickory faced their own form of slow-motion tragedy. As Melania slept and Michaela's absence became apparent, they found themselves guardians of a dying dream. The community that had once represented hope for all those rejected by the Golden Order began to crumble around them, its founder gone and its protector unconscious. The rot within their bodies continued to progress during this time, claiming more of their humanity with each passing day. Yet, they maintained their posts, performing their duties, even as their ability to do so diminished. Some eventually succumbed entirely to the corruption, becoming the shambling creatures that populate the lower levels of the hick tree. Others maintained enough of their consciousness to continue serving, though at tremendous cost to their remaining dignity and comfort. The arrival of the tarnished at the hick tree represented both hope and horror for these devoted knights. Here was someone with the power to potentially wake their mistress from her slumber, but also someone whose very presence meant that their long vigil was finally coming to an end. The battles that the tarnished fought against them were not conflicts between enemies, but mercy killings of warriors who had long since passed the point where death would be a relief. When millennia finally awakened and bloomed for the second time during her battle with the tarnished, the remaining clean wrought knights witnessed the final transformation of the being they had devoted their lives to protecting. Her ascension to full goddess of rot was simultaneously the fulfillment of their devotion and its ultimate corruption, as she became something that no longer needed or wanted their protection. The tragedy of the clean wrought knights extends beyond their individual suffering to encompass what they represented. The way that even the purest forms of loyalty and love could become tools of destruction when directed toward beings whose very nature was corrupted by cosmic forces. Their story serves as a meditation on the price of devotion and the way that noble intentions could lead to terrible outcomes when the objects of that devotion were themselves victims of forces beyond their control. Moving to examine another group caught in the wake of demigod tragedy, we find the Cuckoo Knights, who served Renala during and after her abandonment by Ratigan. These warriors faced a different but equally heartbreaking situation. Their queen's mind had been shattered by grief, leaving them to serve a leader who could no longer provide meaningful guidance or purpose. The Cuckoo Knights had originally been among the finest warriors in the lands between. Their magical abilities and tactical prowess making them formidable opponents for any force that challenged Carrion authority. Their distinctive blue and silver armor, adorned with magical glintstone, marked them as elite soldiers capable of combining physical prowess with sophisticated sorcery. They took pride in their service to the Academy of Raya Lucaria and their queen, viewing themselves as guardians of knowledge and wisdom, as well as military might. Ratigan's departure from Renala to become Ma's second consort created a crisis of identity for these knights that went far beyond simple political upheaval. Their entire worldview had been built around the unity of their royal house and the wisdom of their leaders. When that unity was shattered by Rathagen's abandonment, they found themselves serving a queen who could no longer function as a rational leader. Rinnel's transformation from brilliant sorceress queen to obsessed guardian of an amber egg represented the complete breakdown of everything the Cuckoo Knights had sworn to protect. The woman they had followed into battle, whose magical innovations had revolutionized their understanding of combat sorcery, had become a figure of pity rather than respect. Yet their oaths bound them to continue serving her regardless of her condition. The psychological impact of watching their beloved queen's deterioration played out over months and years created a unique form of trauma for these warriors. They had to maintain the pretense that their service still had meaning, while privately recognizing that their queen was no longer capable of the leadership they desperately needed. This cognitive dissonance created a deep sense of purposelessness that no amount of duty or honor could address. Some of the Cuckoo Knights attempted to maintain the fiction that their service remained meaningful by focusing on protecting the academy itself rather than their queen personally. They threw themselves into defending the institution's accumulated knowledge and maintaining its traditions, hoping that by preserving the framework of their former lives, they could somehow recapture their lost sense of purpose. Others became increasingly protective of Ranella herself, treating her fragile mental state as something to be guarded as carefully as any physical treasure. These knights developed an almost parental relationship with their queen, monitoring her behavior and shielding her from anything that might cause additional distress. Their military training was repurposed into a form of psychiatric care for which they were completely unprepared. The arrival of students and scholars at the academy during this period created additional complications for the Cuckoo Knights. These newcomers often came seeking the wisdom and guidance that Renée had once provided, only to discover that she was no longer capable of coherent instruction. The knights found themselves in the position of having to turn away seekers of knowledge, while maintaining the pretense that the academy remained a functioning institution. The presence of Renella's children during this period added another layer of complexity to the knight situation. Rand's increasing involvement with dark sorceries and political conspiracies, Raiden's focus on military campaigns, and Rykard's growing extremism all represented divergent paths that their mother was incapable of guiding or controlling. The knights watched helplessly as the royal family they had served dissolved into competing factions. When the shattering began and the demigods went to war, the Cuckoo Knights faced the terrible realization that their queen would play no meaningful role in determining the lands between's future, while other factions rallied behind charismatic leaders with clear goals and purposes. They found themselves defending a kingdom that existed more in memory than in reality. Some knights chose to abandon their posts during this period, seeking service with other demigods who could provide the sense of purpose and direction that Renala could no longer offer. These departures were not acts of cowardice, but recognition that their oaths had become meaningless in the face of their queen's incapacity. Yet each departure further weakened the institution they had all sworn to protect. The knights who remained found themselves gradually taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to their queen, making decisions about academy policy and carrion territory that they had no formal authority to make. This assumption of power was driven by necessity rather than ambition, but it represented a fundamental betrayal of the hierarchical principles that had once governed their service. The magical corruption that began to affect the academy during this period, the emergence of hostile sorcerers, the proliferation of dangerous magical experiments, the breakdown of institutional controls reflected the broader chaos that resulted from the absence of effective leadership. The knights found themselves fighting not just external enemies, but the consequences of their own institution's decay. When the Tarnished eventually arrived at the academy seeking to challenge Renala, the Cuckoo Knights faced their final test of loyalty. They knew that their queen was in no condition to face a serious challenger. Yet, their oaths required them to defend her. The battles they fought were not attempts to achieve victory, but desperate efforts to buy time for a miracle that would never come. Their defeat by the Tarnished represented not just a military loss, but the final collapse of a way of life that had once given their existence meaning. The institution they had devoted their lives to protecting was revealed to be a hollow shell, maintained only by their own stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. The ultimate tragedy of the Cuckoo Knights lies in their realization that their loyalty, while admirable in its consistency, had ultimately served no constructive purpose. They had spent years of their lives protecting something that was already lost, fighting for a cause that could never be won, serving a queen who could no longer benefit from their service. Examining the followers of Mog, Lord of Blood, reveals yet another facet of how demigod tragedy rippled outward to affect countless others. The sanguine nobles and other servants who gathered in Majin Palace were drawn not by Moog's obvious virtues, but by his promise to value those whom society had rejected and forgotten. The blood cult that formed around MG attracted beings from across the spectrum of outcasts and misfits. Omen, like himself, who had been cast aside by the Golden Order, Albinaurics who faced systematic discrimination, former knights who had lost faith in their oaths, and countless others who had found no place in the established order. For these individuals, Moog's message of blood and rebirth offered something that had been denied to them elsewhere, a sense of belonging and purpose. The transformation rituals that characterize Moog's cult were both empowering and destructive, offering participants increased power and status within the community, while fundamentally altering their nature in ways that made return to normal society impossible. Those who underwent these rituals found themselves bound to the cult not just by loyalty, but by the simple fact that they could no longer exist anywhere else. The sanguine nobles who served as Moog's lieutenants represented the most successful products of his cult's transformation rituals. These beings had gained significant magical power and social status within the underground kingdom, but at the cost of their essential humanity. Their elegant appearance and sophisticated mannerisms fundamental corruption that made them as much prisoners of the cult as its beneficiaries. The blood magic that formed the foundation of Mog's power required constant sacrifice from his followers, creating a community where devotion was measured not by faith or service, but by willingness to literally give of oneself. The cult's practices created a hierarchy based on how much blood members were willing to donate, leading to a culture where self-destruction was celebrated as the highest form of loyalty. The presence of the kidnapped Michaela at the heart of Mugwin Palace created a deeply disturbing dynamic within the cult community. Members were required to participate in rituals centered around the unconscious Empyrean, offering their blood to nourish him while he remained completely unaware of their existence. This one-sided relationship became a metaphor for the cult's broader dysfunction. The war surgeons who served Moog represented a particularly tragic subset of his followers. These medical professionals had once dedicated their skills to healing and preservation of life, only to find themselves conscripted into practices that perverted everything they had once believed in. Their surgical abilities were repurposed for blood extraction and ritual modification, turning their healing knowledge into instruments of harm. Many of these surgeons had joined Moog's cult not out of any desire for power or belonging, but simply because their professional skills made them valuable to the organization. Once within the cult sphere of influence, they found themselves gradually corrupted by the blood magic they were required to practice, losing their moral boundaries along with their professional ethics. The teleportation network that connected various blood cult sites throughout the lands between created a hidden infrastructure of suffering that most surface dwellers never suspected existed. Members of the cult could move freely between these locations, but their ability to access normal society became increasingly limited as their involvement deepened. The recruitment practices employed by the blood cult were particularly insidious, targeting individuals at their most vulnerable moments and offering solutions to their problems that seemed reasonable at first, but led inexorably toward total dependence on the organization. New members often found themselves isolated from their former lives before they fully understood what they had committed to. The eventual discovery of Moog's ultimate goal to transform Michaela into a god and position himself as that god's consort revealed the extent to which even the cult's most devoted members were merely tools in their leader's personal obsession. Years of sacrifice and devotion had served not the greater good of the community, but the fulfillment of one demigod's psychological needs. When the Tarnished finally confronted Morg in his palace throne room, the blood cult's members faced the collapse of everything they had built their new lives around. The defeat of their lord meant not just the loss of a leader, but the dissolution of the only community that had ever accepted them. Many found themselves facing a choice between death and a return to the very society that had originally rejected them. The aftermath of Moog's defeat scattered his followers across the lands between. Many of them, too transformed by their experiences to successfully reintegrate into normal society. Some became wandering outcasts, their blood magic making them feared and avoided by ordinary people. Others simply disappeared, unable to find any place where their altered nature would be accepted. The tragedy of Moog's followers extends beyond their individual suffering to encompass the broader question of what happens to society's outcasts when their attempts to find alternative communities lead them into destructive relationships. Their story serves as a warning about the vulnerability of the rejected and the ease with which legitimate grievances can be exploited by those with ulterior motives. The scholars and students who gathered around Rayard at Volcano Manor before his transformation represent another category of collateral damage in the demigods' tragedies. These intellectuals were drawn by genuine idealism and a sincere desire to create a more just world, only to find themselves gradually corrupted by the very methods they had hoped to use for positive change. The early days of Volcano Manor's intellectual community were marked by vibrant debates about law, justice, and the nature of legitimate authority. Brilliant minds from across the lands between gathered to discuss alternatives to the Golden Order's rigid hierarchy, producing treatises and theories that might have formed the foundation for genuine reform if circumstances had been different. The transformation of this scholarly community into a training ground for assassins and cultists represents one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Rykard's story. These individuals had joined his cause because they believed in the possibility of change through reason and knowledge, only to find themselves participants in increasingly violent and extreme actions. The process of corruption was so gradual that many participants failed to recognize it until they had passed the point of no return. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, supporting this assassination because the target was genuinely corrupt, endorsing this violent action because peaceful methods had failed, embracing this forbidden knowledge because it might lead to breakthrough insights. The scholars who remained loyal to Rykard through his transformation into the god-devouring serpent, faced the ultimate test of their philosophical flexibility. They had to reconcile their commitment to reason and knowledge with service to a being whose very existence defied rational explanation. Many resolved this contradiction by abandoning their former principles entirely, embracing a nihilistic worldview that celebrated destruction for its own sake. Others attempted to maintain some vestige of their former idealism by interpreting Rykard's transformation as a necessary step toward a greater good that they could not yet comprehend. These individuals created elaborate philosophical justifications for supporting the serpent god, convincing themselves that their continued service served some cosmic purpose beyond mere destruction. The physical transformation of Volcano Manor itself during this period reflected the intellectual corruption of its inhabitants. Libraries that had once housed works on law and ethics were converted to laboratories for blasphemous research. Meeting halls where scholars had once debated philosophy became chambers where prisoners were fed to the god-devouring serpent. The recruitment of new members during Rykard's serpentine phase took on an increasingly sinister character as the manor's inhabitants learned to identify and exploit the same idealistic impulses that had originally drawn them to the community. They became predators of hope, targeting individuals whose desire for justice could be twisted into service to their monstrous lord. Tanith's role as the manor's hostess during this period represents perhaps the most tragic transformation of all. Once Rykard's genuine partner and intellectual equal, she became the primary recruiter for his cult of consumption, using her charm and intelligence to lure new victims into the serpent's coils. Her continued love for what Rykard had become demonstrated the power of emotional attachment to overcome even the most obvious moral boundaries. The knights and soldiers who served at Volcano Manor during its final phase found themselves caught between their loyalty to their original cause and their horror at what that cause had become. Many had joined Rykard's rebellion because they genuinely believed in fighting injustice, only to discover that they had become servants of something far worse than what they had originally opposed. The final assault on Volcano Mana by the Tarnished represented not just a military campaign, but a mercy killing of an intellectual community that had lost its way so completely that redemption was no longer possible. The scholars and knights who fell defending their transformed lord were not evil beings, but tragic figures whose noble intentions had been corrupted beyond recognition. Turning our attention to the broader population of the lands between, we see how the demigods' personal tragedies created waves of suffering that touched every corner of society. The common people who lived under their rule often paid prices for conflicts they barely understood, becoming casualties in wars between cosmic forces that had little relevance to their daily lives. The economic devastation caused by the shattering created famines and shortages that claimed more lives than the actual battles between demigods. Trade routes that had functioned for generations were disrupted by the constant warfare, leaving entire communities without access to essential goods. Agricultural regions were abandoned as farmers fled the fighting, leading to widespread hunger, even in areas that saw no direct combat. The breakdown of central authority created a power vacuum that was filled by various local strongmen, bandits, and petty warlords who exploited the chaos for their own benefit. These figures often proved to be even more oppressive than the demigods they replaced, lacking both the power to maintain order and the divine mandate that had once legitimized centralized rule. The rise of various cults and alternative belief systems during this period reflects the population's desperate search for meaning in a world where traditional sources of authority had proven themselves unworthy of trust. The worship of outer gods, the embrace of nihilistic philosophies, and the turn toward increasingly extreme forms of religious expression all represent attempts to find spiritual stability in a reality that seemed to have lost all coherent structure. The emergence of those who live in death as a significant presence throughout the lands between created new forms of suffering that transcended the traditional boundaries between life and death. Families found themselves terrorized by the reanimated corpses of loved ones, while communities struggled to develop new burial practices that might prevent their dead from rising again. The psychological trauma inflicted on the surviving population by years of constant warfare and uncertainty created a generation marked by despair and hopelessness. Children grew up knowing only conflict, with no memory of the peace and prosperity that had once characterized the lands between. The very concept of stable government became alien to people who had lived their entire lives watching divine rulers destroy each other. The various attempts by local communities to maintain some semblance of normal life in the face of cosmic chaos demonstrate the resilience of ordinary people, but also the limitations of that resilience when faced with forces beyond their comprehension or control. Villages that had survived for centuries were abandoned overnight when demigod conflicts made their locations untenable. The refugee populations that formed around the edges of the major conflicts created their own forms of suffering as displaced people struggled to survive in unfamiliar territories without the support systems they had lost. These communities often became targets for bandits and cultists who saw them as easy prey, creating cycles of victimization that extended far beyond the original causes of displacement. The gradual breakdown of infrastructure throughout the lands between roads, bridges, communication networks, and administrative systems created a cascade of secondary problems that made recovery increasingly difficult. Even when active fighting ceased in particular regions, the institutional knowledge required to maintain civilization was lost along with the institutions themselves. The various factions that emerged during the shattering often recruited from among these displaced and desperate populations, offering food and protection in exchange for military service. Many ordinary people found themselves fighting in wars they didn't understand for causes they didn't believe in, simply because they had no other options for survival. And so concludes our journey through the tragic fates of Elden Ring's demigods. We've discovered how divine blood became both blessing and curse, how family bonds could be twisted into instruments of destruction, and how the very qualities that made these beings special also ensured their doom. The legacy of Godwyn, Melania, Miquella, Ronnie, Raiden, Rykard, Morgott, Moog, Mesma, and all the others continues to shape the world they left behind, a testament to both their power and their pain. Next time on Idea Portal to RPG, we'll explore the outer gods and their influence on the lands between, examining how cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension shaped the fates we've discussed tonight. Until then, sweet dreams, fellow adventurers, and may your rest be unmarked by the curses that plagued these divine children. If you enjoyed this journey through Elden Ring's most tragic stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep 2 RPG for more epic lore to help you drift off to peaceful sleep. Your support helps us continue exploring the deep mysteries of gaming's greatest worlds. The moment of Rykard's ultimate fall came when he chose to offer himself as a sacrifice to the god-devouring serpent, an ancient entity whose power came from literally consuming other divine beings. This decision was not made in a moment of madness or desperation, but was the logical conclusion of his philosophical journey. If the gods themselves were corrupt and their order fundamentally unjust, then perhaps the solution was to devour them entirely and start anew. The transformation that followed was both physical and spiritual. Ryk's human form was consumed by the serpent, but rather than dying, he merged with the creature to become something neither fully human nor fully serpent. This new being retained Rykard's memories and intelligence, but possessed the serpent's endless hunger and alien perspective on existence. The merger created a creature capable of literally devouring gods, making it perhaps the most dangerous entity in the lands between. Yet, even as Rykard gained the power he had sought, he lost the very humanity that had motivated his original rebellion. The serpent's hunger was not merely for flesh, but for existence itself. It desired to consume everything, not to create a better world, but simply to feed its own endless appetite. Rykard's noble goal of creating a more just order became perverted into a simple desire for destruction and consumption. The family he had built at Volcano Manor began to reflect this corruption. What had started as a community of idealistic rebels gradually transformed into a cult of personality centered around Reich's monstrous new form. The man's residents, once united by shared principles and common cause, became bound together by their devotion to feeding their lord's appetite for destruction. The tragic irony of Reichard's fate is that he succeeded in his original goal of gaining the power to challenge the established order. But in doing so, he became something far worse than what he had sought to replace. The god-devouring serpent represented not liberation from cosmic tyranny, but the triumph of chaos over any form of meaningful existence. In trying to save the world from unjust gods, Reichard had become a threat to the very concept of order itself. His final words to those who would challenge him reveal the depth of his transformation. No longer speaking of justice or reform, he speaks only of the family that will join him in his endless feast of consumption. The idealistic praetor who had once sought to protect the innocent had become a monster whose only desire was to drag others down into his own corruption. The twin prodigies, Millennia and Miquela, represent perhaps the most heartbreaking tragedy in all of Elden Ring's law. Born of the union between Queen Ma and Rathagen, who were revealed to be two aspects of the same divine being. These children inherited not just immense power, but terrible curses that would define their entire existence. Their story is one of love, sacrifice, and the gradual corruption of the purest intentions by forces beyond their control. Miquela, the elder of the twins, despite his eternally youthful appearance, was cursed with Nenti, doomed to remain forever in the body of a child, regardless of how much time passed or wisdom he gained. This curse was not merely physical, but spiritual, preventing him from growing into his full power as an Empyrean, and limiting his ability to interact with the world as an adult. Yet rather than allowing this limitation to embitter him, Miquela channeled his frustration into an obsessive desire to help others, particularly his beloved twin sister. Millennia's curse was even more visible and destructive. From birth, she was afflicted with the scarlet rot, a cosmic plague that slowly consumed her body from within. Over time, the rot claimed her eyes, leaving her blind, and forced the amputation of limbs that had become too corrupted to function. These lost parts were replaced with prosthetics of unalloyed gold. Miquela's own invention, designed to resist the influence of outer gods and slow the progression of her disease. The relationship between the twins transcended normal sibling bonds, becoming a partnership forged in mutual understanding of suffering and shared determination to overcome their respective curses. Miquela dedicated his considerable intellect and magical abilities to finding cures for both their conditions, while Millennia served as his protector and champion, wielding her sword in defense of his research and ideals. Miquella's rejection of the Golden Order fundamentalism came when he realized that its rigid doctrines offered no hope for beings like himself and his sister. The established religious and magical practices of the realm were designed for beings who fit neatly into predetermined categories, not for cursed demigods whose very existence challenged the Order's claims of perfection and divine favor. This rejection led Miquella to develop entirely new forms of magic and technology, most notably the creation of unalloyed gold. This miraculous substance could resist the influence of outer gods, potentially offering protection from the cosmic forces that had cursed both twins. The development of unalloyed gold needles gave Millennia some relief from her rot's progression, though it could never fully cure her condition. The creation of the hick tree represents Miquella's most ambitious attempt to solve their problems through his own power, rather than relying on existing systems. Using his own divine blood as sustenance, he nurtured a sapling that grew into a massive tree intended to rival the tree itself. This new tree would serve as a sanctuary for all those rejected by the Golden Order, the Omen, the Misbegotten, the Albinaurics, and any others deemed unworthy by the established powers. The Hagree became more than just a refuge. It was a statement of principles. Under its branches, beings were valued not for their adherence to arbitrary standards of purity, but for their inherent worth as living creatures. The community that grew around the tree reflected Miquella's vision of a more inclusive and compassionate order, one that could embrace diversity rather than demanding conformity. Yet, even as Miquella worked to create this better world, he faced the fundamental limitation of his cursed nature. Trapped in a child's body, he lacked the physical presence and apparent authority that others expected from a leader. His attempts to mature by encasing himself within the Hicker's cocoon were interrupted by the manations of his half-brother Mog, who kidnapped the slumbering Empyrean for his own twisted purposes. Millennia's role as Miquella's protector and champion placed her in an impossible position during the shattering. When various demigods began fighting over the fragments of the Elden Ring, she faced the choice between remaining by her brother's side and actively working to secure the power he would need to realize his vision. Her decision to take up arms and lead military campaigns in support of Miquella's cause spoke to both her devotion and her recognition that passive protection would not be enough. The Battle of Ionia against Raiden represents the culmination of Millennia's internal struggle between her desire to protect others and the destructive power she carried within herself. Throughout her life, she had fought against the Scarlet Rot's influence, refusing to allow it to define her or limit her choices. Yet, when faced with an opponent she could not defeat through skill alone, she made the terrible choice to unleash the very corruption she had spent her life containing. The blooming of the first scarlet Ionia transformed the entire region of Cade into a rotting wasteland, demonstrating the true scope of the destruction Millennia had been holding back through sheer force of will. The sight of her home transformed into a hellscape of decay, and corruption filled her with such anguish that she fell into a coma, unable to bear the weight of what she had done, even in service to her brother's noble cause. The tragedy of Millennia's situation was that her greatest act of love, her willingness to unleash her curse to protect Miquela's interests, became also her greatest failure. The corruption she spread did nothing to advance her brother's goals, while causing immense suffering to innocent people and creatures throughout Khalid. Her sacrifice achieved nothing except the destruction of countless lives, and the revelation that even the most noble intentions could not redeem the use of fundamentally evil power. When clean-wrought Knight Finlay carried the coma's Millennia back to the hick tree, it was to discover that their efforts had been for nothing. Miquela was gone, kidnapped by Mog, while his protector fought distant battles in his name. The very devotion that had driven Millennia to such extremes had prevented her from being present when her brother needed her most. Millennia's vigil at the base of the hick tree, waiting for a brother who would never return, represents one of the most poignant images in all of gaming. Here was a warrior who had conquered armies and laid waste to entire regions, reduced to simply waiting and hoping for the return of the one person who gave her life meaning. Her faith in Miquela's eventual return never wavered, even as the hick tree began to decay around her, and the community they had built together started to crumble. The revelation in shadow of the Erdtree that Miquela had deliberately abandoned his love and compassion in his quest for godhood adds another layer of tragedy to their story. The brother for whom Millennia had sacrificed everything had chosen to discard the very qualities that had made their relationship special. In pursuing the power to create a better world, Miquela had made himself incapable of the love that had originally motivated his quest. This transformation means that even if Miquela were to return to the hick tree, he would no longer be the brother Millennia remembered. The being she waited for so faithfully had ceased to exist, replaced by something that might wear his face, but could never again feel the compassion that had once driven him to help her bear her curse. From the shadow of the Erdtree, we learn of Messer, the Impaler, another of Ma's children, whose story reveals the length to which a divine mother would go to hide her shame and protect her reputation. Mesma represents the demigod that the Golden Order tried to erase from history, whose very existence challenged the narrative of divine perfection that Ma sought to maintain. born with an abyssal serpent dwelling within him. Mesma was marked from birth as something that the Golden Order could not accept or explain. The presence of this internal entity, possibly connected to ancient forces that predated the current cosmic order, made him a living contradiction to the Golden Order's claims of divine purity and perfect governance. Queen Ma's response to her son's condition reveals the depths of her political pragmatism and personal callousness. Rather than seeking to understand or heal Mesma's condition, she chose to hide it, plucking out one of his eyes and replacing it with a seal of grace designed to suppress the serpent's influence. This brutal modification served not to cure her son, but merely to make his condition less visible, treating the symptom rather than addressing the underlying cause. The decision to exile Mesma to the land of shadow represents Ma's ultimate abandonment of maternal duty in favor of political necessity. Unable to reconcile his existence with the image she wished to project, she sent him away to wage a crusade against the Hornet, the people who had once threatened her own rise to power. This exile served the dual purpose of removing an embarrassing reminder of imperfection while striking a blow against old enemies. Mesma's crusade in the land of shadow was presented as a holy war, a righteous campaign to spread the light of grace to those who dwelt in darkness. In reality, it was a war of revenge and genocide designed to eliminate the Hauntent culture that had once persecuted Ma's people. The irony was not lost on those who participated. They were committing the same acts of cultural destruction that had once been inflicted upon their queen's homeland. The psychological impact of this abandonment on Mesma cannot be overstated. Here was a child who had already suffered the trauma of having a foreign entity dwelling within his body, subjected to painful surgical modification, and then exiled from everything he had ever known. His mother's message was clear. His existence was a problem to be managed rather than a life to be cherished. Yet, despite this treatment, Mesma retained a tragic loyalty to his mother and her cause. His crusade in the land of shadow was conducted with thoroughness and efficiency, demonstrating both his military competence and his desperate desire to prove himself worthy of the love that had been withheld from him. Each victory was an attempt to earn the recognition and acceptance that should have been his birthright. The establishment of his own cult of personality among his followers speaks to Mesma's need to find some form of family and belonging in his exile. The soldiers and knights who served under him became the closest thing he had to a real community, bound together by their shared isolation from the homeland they served. Yet even these relationships were colored by the fundamental inequality between a demigod and mortals, preventing the genuine connection he desperately needed. Mesma's continued maintenance of a statue of Ma in his chamber, the only one in the land of shadow that remained undefaced, reveals the depth of his enduring hope for reconciliation. Despite everything she had done to him, he continued to believe that somehow, someday, his mother might acknowledge him and welcome him home. This faith in an impossible redemption made his isolation all the more painful. The serpent within Mesma, rather than being simply a curse to be suppressed, might have represented a connection to powers and wisdom that predated the Golden Order's dominance. By forcing him to deny this aspect of his nature, Mara may have prevented him from accessing knowledge and abilities that could have benefited both him and the realm he served. The tragic irony of Mesma's story is that his very qualities, his strength, his loyalty, his willingness to bear any burden for his mother's approval, made him the perfect tool for America's political machinations. A son who demanded recognition and love might have caused problems. A son who desperately sought approval could be manipulated indefinitely. His ultimate fate, dying in service to a cause that his mother had already abandoned, while still believing that his sacrifice might somehow earn him the love he had always been denied, represents one of the most heartbreaking conclusions in all of Elden Ring's law. Mesma never learned that no amount of service or sacrifice could earn what should have been freely given from the moment of his birth. As our journey through the tragic fates of the demigods draws to a close, we must reflect on the patterns that emerge from their stories. Each of these divine-blooded beings began their existence with tremendous potential for good, possessed of power and intelligence that could have transformed the lands between into a paradise of justice and prosperity. Yet in every case, that potential was corrupted or destroyed by forces largely beyond their control. The curses that plagued so many of the demigods, Godwyn's spiritual death, Millennia's scarlet rot, Michaela's eternal youth, Mesma's serpent, were not punishments for personal failings, but cosmic afflictions that shaped their entire existence. These curses forced them into roles and behaviors that often contradicted their true natures, creating internal conflicts that could never be fully resolved. The political pressures of divine rule created additional burdens that mortal rulers never face. The demigods were expected to embody perfection while navigating the competing demands of outer gods, inherited obligations, and personal desires. The cosmic scale of their responsibilities made every decision a matter of potentially world-altering consequence, creating a pressure that would crush any normal being. Queen Mara's own tragic example as a mother reveals how the demands of godhood can corrupt even the most basic human relationships. Her words to her children demanding that they become gods or lords, or else face abandonment, created a competitive dynamic that poisoned any possibility of genuine family bonds. In trying to ensure her children's greatness, she guaranteed their suffering. The shattering itself can be understood as the inevitable result of placing impossible burdens on beings who, despite their divine blood, retained fundamentally human needs for love, acceptance, and meaning. When those needs went unmet, the resulting psychological damage manifested as the conflicts that tore the realm apart. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the demigod stories is that many of their failures stemmed from their virtues rather than their vices. Godwin's trusting nature made him vulnerable to assassination. Millennia's devotion to her brother led her to unleash destruction. Morgoth's loyalty blinded him to the flaws in the system he served. Raiden's heroism consumed him from within. The lesson embedded in these tales is not that power corrupts, though it certainly can, but that the very qualities that make someone worthy of power can also make them vulnerable to exploitation and destruction. The demigods were not undone by their weaknesses, but by their strengths, twisted into forms that served others' agendas rather than their own well-being. Their stories serve as a meditation on the nature of family, duty, and the price of divinity. They remind us that even gods can suffer, that power without love is meaningless, and that the most tragic fates often befall those who least deserve them. In the end, the demigods of Elden Ring are remembered not for their achievements, but for their pain, their struggles, and their ultimate humanity in the face of cosmic indifference. The empty thrones and ruined palaces scattered throughout the lands between stand as monuments to their suffering. Reminders that even divine blood offers no protection against the fundamental cruelties of existence. Their legacy is written not in glory, but in grief, not in triumph, but in the understanding that some burdens are too heavy for any soul to bear, no matter how powerful or noble it might be. And so concludes our journey through the tragic fates of Elden Ring's demigods. We've discovered how divine blood became both blessing and curse, how family bonds could be twisted into instruments of destruction, and how the very qualities that made these beings special also ensured their doom. The legacy of Godwin, Millennia, Miquela, Ronnie, Raiden, Rykard, Morgott, Moog, Mesma, and all the others continues to shape the world they left behind. A testament to both their power and their pain, we'll explore the outer gods and their influence on the lands between, examining how cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension shaped the fates we've discussed tonight. Until then, sweet dreams, fellow adventurers, and may your rest be unmarked by the curses that plagued these divine children. If you enjoyed this journey through Elden Ring's most tragic stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more epic lore to help you drift off to peaceful sleep. Your support helps us continue exploring the deep mysteries of gaming's greatest worlds.